Thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak at this conference. And I just remembered that the Korean War was, I think, the occasion for my first political memory, because I remember being 6 years old in the schoolyard and hearing that the war had ended. I was completely disoriented because I've been used to, for about 3 years, I guess, hearing on the radio daily reports about the war, and it was something I assumed was something that always was and always would be. The idea that it would end hadn't occurred to me until that time. But today I'll discuss the importance of strategic surprise in the Korean War, and will then speculate on some lessons, what the Korean case might tell us about the future and what to worry about. And one comparison I think that's useful to keep in mind is the tremendous similarity between what happened in June 1950 and in August 1990. Two surprises that, in a sense, bracketed the height of the Cold War. Both of these were cases not of the failure of deterrence, but of the failure to attempt deterrence, which in turn, I think, had something to do with the causes of surprise. Well, in the Korean War, there were three cases of strategic surprise of some significance within the war. The outbreak and the North Korean attack, then the American operation at Incheon.
On 16 September, the 1st Marine Division moved through Incheon. Their objective is Seoul.
And third, the Chinese intervention late in 1950.
The unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
The president has stated that the use of the atomic bomb is being considered to halt the communist onrush inspired by Russia.
Or one might say cases of surprise, counter-surprise, and counter-counter-surprise. So this combination underlines how common strategic surprise of various types can be. Well, what caused the surprise in the outbreak of the war? A number of things. One was what one might call just a mistaken strategic frame of reference. Before June 1950, U.S. defense planners thought mainly in terms of World War III, a titanic struggle directly with the USSR comparable to that with Germany and Japan in the early 1940s. They just weren't attuned to the possibility of a limited communist attack in an area of low priority. So the focus was not on the ambitions of Kim Il-sung and the Korean communists, but on plans by the Soviet Union to mount a major offensive in Europe or Japan. In the context of a general war, Korea had no importance. It was a tertiary interest at best. So that's why the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended withdrawing U.S. forces from Korea in 1949. Why waste scarce military resources by tying them down in an unimportant, out-of-the-way area when they'd be needed for the main event elsewhere? Well, a couple lessons, I think, associated with this are first, what became conventional wisdom in the Cold War, but was really not highlighted until the surprise of June 1950, and that was the need for readiness of forces in being, the inability to rely any longer on a mobilization strategy as the United States historically had done. And secondly, the need to make deterrence clear. If the United States was going to fight over certain places, it would make more sense to make crystal clear in advance that it would do so, which in turn might reduce the odds that it might happen. Another cause of surprise was what Roberta Wallstetter in her classic book, Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision, called noise. That is, signals of danger in Korea were embedded in a rash of signals from all sorts of trouble spots. Other areas competed for the attention of intelligence officers concerned with warning. President Truman later wrote that the CIA warned him that North Korea might shift from isolated raids to a full-scale attack at any time, but didn't indicate when or where it was likely to happen. He said, quote, "This did not apply alone to Korea. These same reports also told me repeatedly that there are any number of spots in the world where the Russians possess the capability to attack." Third problem was the cry-wolf syndrome. Numerous false alarms dulled the sensitivity of decision makers to last-minute warnings. There were frequent skirmishes between North Korean infiltrators and South Korean troops in the late 1940s. In 1949, there were 874 recorded border violations. From 1949 through the spring of 1950, there were numerous reports of impending attack, numerous false alerts. The North Korean troops moved toward the border. The movements did not seem very different from previous exercises, annual rotations, or infiltration. All this represented what one might call the routinization of threat. Intelligence and mid-level policy people who paid attention to Korea became accustomed to a constant fluctuating threat. Fourth, deception. In mid-June, North Korean raids stopped. Pyongyang issued peace proposals for unification and elections. And fifth, distraction from the danger of aggression by the fear of provocation. American officials, before June 1950, worried more about a South Korean attack on the North than the reverse. This is one reason why the South Korean army was poorly equipped. American aid was purposely limited to creating a constabulary-type force so that it wouldn't be able to attack Pyongyang. Well, the results of surprise, of course, the disaster of Task Force Smith, the retreat to the Luzon perimeter, the dark days of the first phase of the war. And then the countervailing surprise at Incheon. So we see surprise working both ways. The United States turned the tide in the war after the initial disastrous defeats by mounting a surprise attack of its own in Incheon. Why did that succeed? In large part, one might say because high risk makes low risk. The reason the Incheon operation was such a success, at least in the short term, it was arguably a mixed blessing in that stunning success prompted escalation of goals, the unification of Korea, the march to the Yalu, and the disaster of Chinese intervention. But the reason the Incheon operation was a success in the short term was related to its extraordinarily risky nature. In this sense, as Michael Handel says, high risk is low risk if it dupes the victim into assuming that a certain option isn't viable. And there are other examples of this phenomenon, of course. The several German attacks through the Ardennes, supposedly impassable to many cases of that sort. But virtually all of the professional military leadership, apart from General MacArthur, opposed the plan for landing in Incheon because they feared it might be a fiasco. Incheon was far to the rear of other forces at Busan. Tides and channels were exceptionally tricky. The harbor was shallow. There were dangerous mudflats, rocks, shoals, and a seawall around the city, rather than beaches, which could be crossed more easily, as well as a fortified island in front of the landing area, urban congestion, which would interfere with the ability to fan out and secure the beachhead, port facilities that were apparently insufficient to resupply a four-sized attack force, and other barriers. In short, quite a number of obstacles indicated the operation could easily turn into a disaster. Major General Oliver Smith, the commander of the 1st Marine Division in the operation, at first considered the proposal, quote, preposterous, end quote. The barriers to success also came from the lack of time and resources to prepare the attack. Forces were scarfed up from all around the world, including the Cooks and other marginal troops from scattered Marine units to constitute the invasion force. And the United States also capitalized on deception. Naval forces, American and British, pounded targets on the east coast of Korea to imply the possibility of a landing there. The leaks were engineered to indicate U.S. plans to attack Kunsan, which was far to the south of Incheon. The Air Force concentrated its attacks around Kunsan. A commando raid was launched against Kunsan in order to divert attention from Incheon. Well, the third case in the Korean War of great note, of course, was the Chinese intervention in the fall of 1950. Here, the American victory after Incheon, in a sense, defeated itself by fostering overconfidence. MacArthur's march to the Yalu, the splitting of U.S. forces, etc. This was, in a sense, what was sometimes called victory disease in the early 1940s. The Japanese, in early 1942, after their fantastic initial success, expanded their aims. They became overconfident in their ability to deal with the Americans. Similarly, Incheon was a stunning victory, reversing the ill fortunes of the first phase of the war in one coup de main, restoring the assumptions of U.S. superiority and invincibility that preceded Task Force Smith. Without this overconfidence, it's hard to explain how the United States could overlook an explain away strong warnings of Chinese intervention at several junctures before November 1950. Wishful thinking. In September and October, there were explicit warnings from Zhou Enlai, the Chinese acting chief of staff, conveyed through the Indian ambassador in Beijing, K.M. Panikkar, saying that if U.S. troops crossed the 38th parallel, China would intervene. Truman, though, dismissed these warnings because he considered Panikkar a toady of the Chinese communists, thought he was relaying propaganda and empty threats. And the consensus in the U.S. intelligence community was that the PRC was bluffing. Inhibitions on intelligence collection. Reconnaissance beyond the Yalu was prohibited in order to avoid violating PRC airspace and sovereignty, preventing provocation. So the Far East Command relied primarily on indirect sources. Sometimes these days it's hard to remember the bad old days before satellite reconnaissance made all big military movements fairly easily observable. So on October 3rd, for example, the UN Command Intelligence warned of, quote, some evidence, end quote, that 20 Chinese divisions were in Korea. But these reports also noted that, quote, exaggerations and canards, end quote, were common. On October 12th, the CIA said that the Chinese intervention was, quote, not probable in 1950. By the end of October, the 8th Army had Chinese prisoners who said they were from large units. These reports were discounted. In early November, MacArthur minimized the significance of evidence of Chinese military infiltration. By the last week in November, the evidence had become unmistakable, and MacArthur became alarmed, but then it was too late. Massive Chinese counteroffensive was unleashed, producing the longest retreat in U.S. military history. Well, what do the cases of surprise in Korea tell us about the future or about other problems? As I mentioned before, I find it useful to note the great similarities between the surprise at the beginning of the Korean War and the surprise at the invasion of Kuwait. In neither case was there an attempt to deter because the contingency had not been thought through in advance. Attention was simply diverted to higher order problems and the possibility that conflict in these out-of-the-way places would become the principal threat in the main order of business, just was a totally new idea. So decision makers thought through the problem on the fly. There are other common recurrent phenomena, I think, that were exemplified in June and November of 1950. Attention overload from policymakers of a global power. In June 1950, as I indicated before, high-level policymakers were thinking about other things. They were absorbed in European political problems, NATO diplomacy, the rehabilitation of Japan, the French war in Indochina, detonation of the Soviet atomic bomb shortly before, and numerous other problems. That problem of an overloaded agenda and distraction by other crises never goes away for a superpower, even after the Cold War. It seems to me quite likely to remain a severe problem for the United States as we continue to play the role of global cop and to revel in our status as the single global power. Habituation to tension. The cry wolf or false alert problem is very common in many cases of strategic surprise. And there were numerous, what one might call warning binges in Korea in the 4 decades after the Korean War. And similar problems in regard to Iraq and Kuwait a couple of times in the 1990s after the war there. When you become habituated to tension, it gets that much harder to recognize which of the numerous false alerts is actually the real one. Victory disease. I discussed how this happened, why it's common. It's not inevitable, but it is hard to resist when an initial victory appears cheap, apparently effortless, and stunningly effective. George Bush, Daddy that is, avoided succumbing to victory disease in 1991. But the price of restraint is recriminations about lost opportunities to eliminate sources of instability, such as Saddam Hussein and still bedevils us, threatens unknown future danger with weapons of mass destruction or other threatening designs. Although I think the cost of trying to go to Baghdad, as it were, in 1991, might have proved almost as bad, but different, as the cost of going to the Yalu in 1950. If Truman had reined MacArthur in at the 38th parallel after Inchon. In theory, we could have avoided all of the horror of the rest of the war, but he would also have been bitterly criticized for letting the North Korean government live and not taking advantage of the opportunity to liberate all of Korea. At the time a decision has to be made, the known costs of not exploiting an opportunity may sometimes seem greater than the unknown costs of pursuing advantage to the maximum. It takes a lot of discipline to avoid victory disease. This is all about the classic strategic problem of estimating what Clausewitz called the culminating point of victory, the point at which you've taken maximum advantage of successful attack before becoming overextended and succumbing to the operational advantages of defense by the victim. In a sense, this is the main question for strategy in a limited war. How to avoid undershooting the culminating point, failing to exploit opportunities for advance at low cost, and how to avoid overshooting it and winding up in a disaster like the retreat from the Yalu. Because it's so hard to estimate the culminating point, and because operational success breeds temptation, we see the irony that success in combat can increase vulnerability to negative surprise and can breed strategic failure if policy is not carefully disciplined. Well, what future cases might we worry about that might reflect vulnerability to surprise of the sort experienced in the Korean War? Well, there's still Korea. And there I'd say about whether to worry, yes and no. Why do I think no? Well, there has not been complacency about the threat to Korea since June 1950. We saw wild and crazy behavior by Pyongyang, unmatched by any other country in the world, on a steady schedule for 4 decades after the armistice. Constant violations of the DMZ, regular infiltration of commando teams, tunnels under the DMZ, the Blue House raid and seizure of the USS Pueblo in 1968, attempted assassination of Park Chung-hee and killing of his wife in the process in the early 1970s, the axe murders of 2 American officers in the tree-cutting incident in 1976, bombing of the South Korean cabinet in Rangoon in the early 1980s, numerous kidnappings of South Korean citizens, bombing of the airliner in 1987, clandestine violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the early 1990s, and continued failure to account for diverted fissionable material. All of that established and nurtured the image of Pyongyang as a fanatical rogue state that could do dangerous things at any time. So we've been well aware of the danger that war could break out again in Korea. Political warning, as it were, has been institutionalized. And the apparatus for strategic warning is extremely developed, articulated, well-oiled, ready to work. Well, why to think yes? The reasons to explain away warning in Korea, I think, have grown again. First, crazy, provocative actions by the North Korean government have declined, or the rate at which they occur in the last dozen or more years. The North Korean economic collapse has also engendered an image of that country as a hollow shell, nearly helpless beneath the veneer of high quantity but low quality military power. Also, the recent diplomatic breakthrough makes the North Korean attack scenario look, to many people, now implausible. South Korean President Kim Dae-jung announced that the danger of war on the peninsula has evaporated. The American government now no longer is using the term rogue state in its diplomatic discourse. Personally, I thought it was a dubious term to begin with. All rogue state means to me is a state that wants to revise the status quo or refuses to play by our rules of acceptable behavior. But when you dispense with a term that's been in use, it suggests to me over-optimism about how much has really changed. Anyway, if we get strategic warning in the form of intelligence on North Korean mobilization, it's likely, or at least more likely now than some years ago, to be explained away as a defensive preparation. This is a source of strategic surprise in other cases. For example, the Arabs in 1973, Israeli and American intelligence, seeing the Arab preparations for war, decided that they were probably defensive, worried about an Israeli retaliation after an air battle shortly before. There is a strong impulse to explain away such strategic warning preparation because of the assumption of rationality when dealing with a weak adversary. The assumption that a weak country will not start a war and can't win, and that military preparations must reflect its fear of losing a war that the stronger side might start. Lessons for other flashpoints? Well, what about, say, Taiwan? Again, yes and no. No, in the sense that Taiwan is now, I think, the most apparent danger point for potential crisis and escalation. We're not adequately prepared for it, but we know it's looming. It's not as much of a total surprise as a source of conflict as Korea was in 1950 or Kuwait in 1990. But reasons for yes. There is a likely basis for surprise, though, in the form that Chinese pressure might take, which as far as I can tell, although I live outside the Beltway now, I may not be clued in properly, but as far as I can tell, is not really discussed as broad and invented a set of terms as might be useful. I think, for example, there's a preoccupation with the scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which makes it, in a sense, easy to deal with the problem because for some time it's the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is likely to lack the capability to invade successfully. But what about other options? For example, the announcement in Beijing that ships landing in Taiwan must check in first at the port of Amoy or something like that. What would that do to insurance rates? How much would it take to send Taiwan's trade, on which the country depends completely, into a tailspin? Similarly, a limited blockade, which would also leave to the United States the decision to start the shooting by breaking the blockade if the United States was to become involved in the defense of Taiwan. It seems to me there's a potential for surprise in the sense that China is likely to look for ways that it can use pressure successfully, not play by our rules in an invasion that would be comparatively easy to defeat. Other cases, it's hard to think of many that would register with the same intensity of June 1950 or August 1990. Few potential cases pose a serious apparent threat to material U.S. interests. There's no global struggle now between two ideologies, as when the North Korean attack was read in Washington as the opening wedge for Soviet attempts at global conquest as the analog to the Rhineland in 1936 or Munich. Outside the Middle East, there's no concentration of natural resources on which the health of Western economies depend, as in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in 1990. But what Korea exemplified in 1950 and Kuwait 40 years later was the probability that in a world of complex interests, where the United States views itself as involved in everything important, crisis will break out somewhere over something that was far down on the list of priorities because the scenario that eventuates was not pondered seriously in advance at high levels. Well, let me close by asking, are there any solutions? Unfortunately, after years of studying strategic surprise, I think there are no reliable or consistently effective solutions to the problem. There are ways to reduce or to cushion the danger of surprise, but some incidents of surprise is inevitable. The reasons are overdetermined. Just too many ways an inventive adversary can probe, exploit various natural sources of surprise until the victim's guard is down. Most fixes to problems in the realm of intelligence also create different problems. Fixing one vulnerability often opens up another one. Now, admittedly, I'm a pessimist on the subject, known as a pessimist on it. The full case I make for pessimism, I'd be glad later to refer you to some articles down in my book, Surprise Attack. I'll leave that for anybody who's interested after the main session. But yes, I'm a pessimist, but what I always say about being a pessimist